Imagine standing in the scorched lands of Mesopotamia, where the wind sweeps across the plains like the breath of war itself. Night has fallen, but the darkness cannot hide the truth that tomorrow will decide the fate of two empires. Far to the west, the Macedonian army rests in a sea of flickering torchlight, each flame carving long shadows that dance like restless spirits. The soldiers lie awake, young faces hardened by 6 relentless years of campaigning from the Balkans through Asia Minor, Syria, and down to Egypt. They number only 47,000, a force small enough to count in a day, yet mighty enough to dream of conquering the world. And tomorrow, they must stand against an enemy that outnumbers them more than 5 to 1. Alexander, just 25 years old, sits alone outside his command tent. His gaze drifts toward the horizon, where the last stars fade behind a rising haze of dust. He does not look like a man intimidated by the odds. He looks like someone who has already accepted destiny, someone who believes the gods have written the ending and only ask him to perform his part. His soldiers do not know exactly what he is thinking, but they know him enough to understand one thing. Alexander does not wonder how to survive tomorrow. He wonders how to win. Meanwhile, several kilometers to the east, the camp of the Persian Empire sprawls across the plain like a moving city. It buzzes with voices carried by the desert wind, the neighing of horses, the grinding of chariots, and the clinking of countless pieces of armor. Campfires stretch into the horizon until their light dissolves into the night. Darius III, the great king, moves among his men with regal confidence. He speaks encouragingly to generals and nobles, each of whom bows deeply but cannot fully conceal the tension in their eyes. Twice already, this Macedonian upstart has humiliated Persia, once at Granicus and again at Issus. Losing a third time would mean the end of everything the empire has stood for over 2 centuries. To prevent that, Darius has chosen the battlefield with care. Gaugamela, a vast open plain, has been cleared and leveled by thousands of laborers so that his scythed chariots can tear through enemy ranks without obstruction. It is a field sculpted for destruction, a stage built to end Alexander's advance forever. The Persian army is massive. Some say 250,000. Others claim even more. It is a mosaic of nations gathered from every corner of the empire. Archers from the east, cavalry from Bactria, infantry from Babylon, elite guards from Persia itself. This is not merely an army. It is the embodiment of an empire fighting for its life. When dawn breaks, its light spills across the plain like a blade slicing through fog. Alexander is already awake. His father once taught him that a commander rises before the sun, and he has followed that lesson every day of his life. He steps from his tent and mounts Bucephalus, the great black horse who has carried him since boyhood. As he rides along the lines of his assembled troops, men straighten their backs and raise their weapons in salute. There is no need for fiery speeches. Alexander's presence alone tells them that this is the day history has reserved for them. Around him stand the long spears of the phalanx, a forest of sarissas gleaming in the morning light. To his right waits the companion cavalry, the elite shock troops who will follow him into any storm. Behind them are the Thessalian horsemen, disciplined and steady. Light infantry, slingers, and Cretan archers complete the formation. They know they are outnumbered beyond imagination, but they also know the truth that Alexander has drilled into their bones. Battles are not won by counting men. Battles are won by breaking wills. The Persian line stretches across the plain in a seemingly endless arc. Macedonian soldiers squint to see where it ends, their breath catching when they realize it may not end at all. The scale of the Persian deployment dwarfs anything they have faced before. Yet the Macedonians do not tremble. They tighten their grips on their weapons and wait for their king. Alexander raises his arm. The order rings out across the field. Advance! The Macedonian army moves forward, but not directly toward the Persian center. Instead, it angles slowly to the right, sliding across the battlefield as if trying to escape the snare laid by Darius. It is a strange movement, subtle but deliberate, and one that sends ripples of confusion across the Persian ranks. Darius watches from his elevated chariot and quickly understands the danger. Alexander is trying to pull the Persian army out of position, to lure them away from the carefully prepared killing ground. The great king orders his own lines to shift in response. Tens of thousands of men begin to stretch and adjust, extending the right wing farther and farther as they attempt to outflank Alexander. The movement creates gaps, small at first, then widening with every moment. The Persians do not see the trap forming. Alexander does. Before the armies clash fully, a shockwave tears across the plain as the Persian scythed chariots charge forward. The ground vibrates beneath the pounding hooves of horses bred for war, their eyes wide and foam spraying from their mouths. The blades jutting from the axles spin in deadly arcs, glinting like teeth in the sunlight. For a moment, it seems unstoppable, a storm of metal racing straight toward the Macedonian ranks. But Alexander has trained his men for this. At his signal, the phalanx splits apart, opening corridors through which the charging chariots are lured. Light infantry rush in around them, hurling javelins at the horses, crippling the engines of death before they can build lethal momentum. Some chariots crash, others turn wildly. What should have shattered the Macedonian line dissolves harmlessly into chaos. A wave has struck a wall and broken itself. As the noise of snapping wood fades, the battle shifts into its most brutal phase. The Persian cavalry surges forward. The Macedonian right flank strains under pressure.
We have faced the
Dust
storm,
rises in choking clouds. Screams, metal, and thunderous hooves merge into a single roar that consumes the senses. And through the haze, Alexander sees exactly what he has been waiting for. A gap. A small tear in the Persian line created by their attempt to outflank him. A weakness in a wall of hundreds of thousands. Not many could see it. Fewer could act on it. Alexander does both in an instant. He turns to the companions and shouts a command that will echo across centuries. "Follow me." He lowers his lance, kicks Bucephalus into a charge, and leads a wedge of elite cavalry directly into the opening. They plunge forward like a spear thrust into the heart of an empire. The Persian lines buckle. Men are thrown aside. The formation shreds as Alexander and his riders carve a path toward one target alone: the royal chariot of Darius III. In the swirling chaos, Darius sees the charging wedge bearing down on him. The great king, once the master of the largest empire on earth, feels terror pierce his chest. His guards attempt to hold the line, but Alexander's momentum is unstoppable. For a brief, shattering moment, it seems the two leaders will meet face to face, ending the battle in a single stroke. But Darius turns his chariot and flees. Seeing their king escape, the Persian ranks begin to collapse. It is not a slow crumble, but a catastrophic unraveling. Without leadership, the massive army becomes a swirling mass of confusion. Panic spreads like fire. Soldiers who moments earlier seemed invincible now break and run, tripping over corpses, dropping shields, abandoning hope. Under the blazing sun of Gaugamela, the Persian Empire dies long before the last soldier falls. It dies the moment its king shows his back. When the dust begins to settle, Alexander surveys the field where the sounds of war fade into the distant groans of the wounded. He knows that this day has not merely brought him a victory, it has brought him the world. 47,000 men have defeated 250,000. A young king has toppled an empire centuries old, and the path to Babylon, Persepolis, and the throne of Asia lies open before him. The Battle of Gaugamela is no longer a question of numbers. It is the testament of audacity, intelligence, and unbreakable will. It is the moment when history bends toward the dreams of a single man. The sun had barely sunk beyond the horizon when Alexander's army began to understand the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Gaugamela was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard stretching endlessly under the reddening sky. Thousands of Persian soldiers lay scattered in the dust, abandoned by the king who had promised them victory. Yet among the Macedonians, there was no triumphant shouting. Victory of this scale brought its own kind of silence, a silence heavy with realization. They had broken an empire in a single day, but they all knew that the work of conquest had only just begun. Alexander rode slowly across the devastated plain, Bucephalus stepping carefully among broken spears and shattered chariots. His commanders followed him at a distance, watching the young king's expression, wondering what he was thinking as he looked upon the ruin he had created. It was not pride that gleamed in his eyes. It was a deeper hunger, the knowledge that the world ahead, the world he had dreamed of since childhood, was finally opening to him. Somewhere far ahead of him, Darius III fled into the night with a handful of loyal attendants. The king's flight had been chaotic, a scramble through dust and corpses as he abandoned his position. He had left behind not only his army, but the royal chariot, the bow he carried as a symbol of his kingship, and even his mother's treasured possession, the royal cloak of Persia. Everything sacred to the empire now lay in Alexander's hands. The symbolism was unmistakable. The gods had chosen their victor. As the first fires were lit around the Macedonian camp that night, word spread among the troops that Alexander would not allow rest for long. Gaugamela might have shattered the Persian war machine, but the king himself was still alive, and as long as Darius lived, the dream of Persia could still flicker. Alexander knew this, and so his eyes remained fixed eastward. The soldiers fell asleep exhausted, but each man understood that the next march would carry them not toward another mere battle, but toward the heart of the greatest empire the world had known. The next morning arrived with a cool breeze sweeping across the desert plain. The Macedonians rose with aching limbs, tightened their armor, and prepared to move. The defeat had left the Persians stunned. Their scouts reported disorder everywhere. Villages along the route had already begun sending messengers offering tribute and surrender. News travels faster than armies, and the news that Alexander had triumphed at Gaugamela was racing across Mesopotamia as swiftly as the wind. Resistance collapsed even before the Macedonians arrived. As the army advanced toward Babylon, the city that had once been the jewel of Mesopotamia, Alexander felt the weight of history pressing against his shoulders. Babylon had outlived empires. It had watched Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians rise and fall. Now it awaited him. When the walls finally emerged on the horizon, the Macedonians braced for resistance, for siege engines, for flaming arrows from the ramparts. They found none. Instead, Alexander was met by priests carrying sacred emblems and nobles holding olive branches. The gates swung open without a fight, as if the city had been waiting centuries for this moment. Inside Babylon, an ocean of people filled the streets to greet him. They raised their voices in chants, calling him the King of the World, a title no Greek had ever dared to claim. Alexander rode slowly through the avenues, while garlands of flowers rained down from rooftops. It was the first time in his life he felt the power of kingship not just as a military achievement, but as a mantle of destiny. The temples offered sacrifices in his honor. The nobles presented treasure beyond imagination. Even the defeated Persian officials bowed before him as their new lord. But amid the splendor, Alexander kept his gaze steady and cold. Somewhere far to the northeast, Darius was gathering what remained of his authority, trying to rebuild a shattered throne. Alexander knew that until Darius was taken, captured, or dead, the conquest of Persia would never be complete. So even as he accepted Babylon's submission, he was already thinking about the next march. His mind never lingered on victory. It always leapt ahead to the next horizon. After Babylon came Susa, another city that surrendered without resistance. Its treasury was legendary, filled with gold and silver accumulated through centuries of imperial rule. The Macedonians stared in awe at the mountains of wealth stored in its vaults. No conqueror in history had seized riches of such scale in so short a time. Alexander, however, saw only opportunity. Wealth was not a luxury, but a weapon. It could fund new armies, buy loyalty, build cities, and carve his name into eternity. The treasure of Susa was the lifeblood of his future empire. Yet even with these victories, Alexander's gaze was fixed on a single place, Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, the symbol of the Achaemenid dynasty's divine authority. To conquer the empire meant to take Persepolis. To take Persepolis meant to break the spirit of Persia forever. He knew it would not surrender easily. Unlike Babylon and Susa, Persepolis was a city tied to identity, heritage, and pride. Taking it would not merely be a conquest. It would be an act of transformation. The march to Persepolis was harsh, passing through mountains and valleys where Persian loyalists still lurked. Winter winds cut through armor, and rocky passes slowed their advance. The Macedonians pressed on, driven not only by Alexander's command, but by the knowledge that they were carving a path through the last defenses of a dying empire. When they reached the Persian gates, a narrow pass guarded by warriors who refused to yield, the battle was fierce and bloody. But Alexander found a way around the cliffs, outflanked the defenders, and crushed them in a maneuver that mirrored the brilliance he had shown at Gaugamela. Every obstacle Persia placed before him became another stone paving his way forward. When Persepolis finally appeared on the horizon, its tremendous palace complex shimmering beneath the sun, the soldiers felt a mixture of awe and anticipation. They had heard stories of its grandeur since the days of their fathers, tales of columns rising like forests of marble and halls carved with images of kings who claimed divine authority. Now, those halls awaited the young foreign conqueror whose ambition had surpassed even their own myths. Alexander entered Persepolis not as a destroyer at first, but as a king claiming his inheritance. Yet the weight of what the city represented lingered in the air. This was the heart of the empire that had once invaded Greece under Xerxes, the empire that had burned Athens, the empire whose shadow had hung over their ancestors for generations. To stand inside Persepolis was to stand inside the memory of an ancient rivalry. The night the palace burned would become one of the most debated acts of Alexander's life, but that moment still lay ahead. For now, he walked the halls of kings long dead, sensing the shifting of ages around him. He knew that his victory at Gaugamela had not only opened the gates of these cities, it had set him on a path from which there was no turning back. His march was no longer about Persia alone. It was about something greater, something he felt but could not yet name. Across the empire, the people whispered the same question. Was Alexander merely a conqueror, or was he becoming something more? A king? A myth? A force of nature? He did not yet know the answer, but he knew that the chase was not over. Darius still lived, a wounded lion retreating deeper into the east. And Alexander, who had never stopped pursuing anything he desired, would soon follow him into lands unknown, driven by a hunger that no victory could satisfy. The fall of Persepolis marked more than the end of a capital. It marked the symbolic death of an empire that had once commanded half the known world. Alexander understood the weight of that moment, standing inside halls whose carvings told stories older than the memory of any Macedonian. Yet even as flames eventually rose through the palace with a fury that illuminated his triumph, he knew the war was not over. The empire was broken, but its king still lived, and the idea of Persia still clung to the mountains and deserts that stretched endlessly to the east. Darius had fled again, leaving only dust and uncertainty in his wake. And Alexander could feel that the chase had become something more than political necessity. It had become personal. The world had to witness one final moment, a decisive ending that would silence the past and legitimize the future he was building. He gathered his commanders and made clear that they would not rest among the riches of Persepolis. Their next march would carry them deeper into lands few Greeks had ever seen. The Persian heartland was vast, and though its armies had shattered at Gaugamela, its satraps still commanded loyalty in scattered pockets. Rumors spread that Darius was raising another force, drawing the remnants of his authority together like fragments of broken glass. Alexander could not allow those fragments to harden into resistance. So as spring approached, he set his army on the road once more, driving them into the highlands where winter still clung to the rocks. They moved through narrow passes and along steep ridges where the wind screamed like a warning, and each step forward felt like a march into the unknown. Villages offered little resistance, but the terrain itself felt hostile, as though nature favored the Persians and wanted to delay the fate approaching their king. Scouts reported that Darius had taken refuge in Media, then retreated farther into Bactria, carried by a dwindling retinue that still called him King of Kings, despite the weight of defeat hanging heavily on his shoulders. Alexander pressed harder. He no longer cared about distance. He no longer cared about the exhaustion etched into his soldiers' faces. He cared only for the moment when he would stand before the man who had twice run from him on the battlefield, the man whose flight at Gaugamela had been the hinge of destiny. Alexander carried with him a conviction that kingship was not merely about ruling, but about ending what one began. And he had begun the destruction of Persia. As the army pushed deeper into the mountains, they reached a place the Persians believed impenetrable. Later, it would be called the Persian Gate, a narrow defile where jagged cliffs rose like stone guardians. It was a natural fortress, a choke point where a small force could stop armies far greater in number. And that is precisely what awaited them. Persian troops still loyal to Darius held the heights, watching as Alexander's column wound its way through the pass. The Persians' last hope lay in this place, their belief that the empire could still be saved by crushing Alexander here, in a place where his cavalry could not maneuver and his phalanx could not spread its wings. Alexander recognized the danger too late. Suddenly, spears rained from above, and rolling boulders crashed down with terrifying force. Men were hurled from the path, shields shattered, and horses screamed as they fell. The mountains that had seemed indifferent now turned violent, a weapon in the hands of defenders who knew every crag and shadow. For the first time since his campaign began, Alexander felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. The sensation that defeat was not only possible, it was close. The pass became a funnel of chaos, bodies pushing against bodies as the Macedonians struggled to shield themselves from a storm they could not answer. The Persians shouted triumphantly as the invaders faltered. For a moment, it seemed as if Alexander's unstoppable momentum had finally met its end. But Alexander was not a man who allowed terrain or ambush to dictate the end of his story. He withdrew with discipline, reforming his men outside the deadly corridor. He refused to accept that the empire he had torn apart could halt him here with rocks and arrows. So he spent the night studying the surrounding cliffs, sending scouts to search for paths, cracks, anything that could lead him behind the Persian line. His instincts sharpened by years of war, he sensed that the enemy believed this narrow throat of stone was their salvation. That confidence would be their undoing. When dawn returned, Alexander had found what he needed. A hidden track curled along the mountainside, steep and treacherous, but passable for a determined detachment. He led that group personally, climbing under cover of darkness and emerging behind the Persian defenders. At the same time, his main force launched a frontal attack, drawing the Persians' eyes forward while Alexander descended upon them from behind. Panic erupted in an instant. What had been an impregnable position turned into a trap for its own defenders, as Macedonians surged from both directions. The Persians fought with desperation, but the tide had turned. The last strategic hope of the empire collapsed, crushed between Alexander's determination and the very stones they had trusted to protect them. With the Persian gate shattered, the march east continued. Each village they passed offered less resistance than the last. Word of Alexander traveled faster than any messenger could carry. He was no longer just a conqueror. He was becoming a force of inevitability. A man who defeated armies designed to surround him, who destroyed cities that resisted him, who walked through natural fortresses as though he had been born to unmake them. And yet, even with every victory, he found no satisfaction. His mind remained fixed on Darius, the man he had spent years pursuing across continents and battlefields. To Alexander, Persia without Darius was an empire without a head. Defeating its armies meant little if the king who commanded them still breathed. Scouts soon brought word that Darius was not gathering troops anymore. The king was instead moving quickly, desperately, deeper into the eastern provinces. His authority had crumbled. Many of his nobles had abandoned him. Others whispered that surrendering Darius might earn favor with Alexander. Every rumor only fueled the young Macedonian's drive. The end was close. He could feel it. He pushed his men harder than before, forcing them across barren lands and rugged mountains, all to reach the fugitive king whose shadow still stretched over the empire he had taken. Alexander imagined confronting him face to face, offering terms, perhaps even treating him with the dignity shown to fallen kings. But fate was already shaping a different ending. As the Macedonians closed in, they learned that Darius's own relatives and satraps had turned against him. Led by Bessus, they imprisoned the king, believing that delivering his throne and his life into their hands would position them to negotiate power with the conqueror who chased them. But Alexander was not chasing a political trophy. He was chasing closure. When he finally reached the Persian camp, he found only silence. The men who had once sworn loyalty to Darius fled at the sight of Macedonian banners. And in the center of an abandoned field, inside a crude wagon, Alexander found the broken king he had sought for years, dying from wounds inflicted by his own commanders. It was not how Alexander imagined it. It was not how he wanted Persia to fall. But as he approached the dying king, he felt the full weight of what this moment meant. Darius, the ruler of a continent, the man who had once stood before the largest army the ancient world had ever seen, now lay dressed in dust instead of royal robes. The empire had abandoned him long before Alexander arrived. And when Darius took his final breath, Alexander knelt beside him, covering the body with his own cloak. He ordered that the king be buried with honor, as though he were a fallen ally rather than an enemy. Because in that moment, Alexander understood something deeper than conquest. A king's worth was measured not in survival, but in how his story ended. And this ending was a tragedy that even victory could not erase. But with Darius dead, the path forward changed forever. Persia had no king. The throne of Asia stood empty. And Alexander, whose ambition extended farther than any horizon, stepped into a new chapter, not as conqueror, but as heir to an empire reshaped by his will. Gaugamela had shattered Persia, but Darius's death sealed it. The old world was gone. A new world was forming around the man who refused to stop moving. With Darius gone, something shifted in the world, as though the great tension that had defined Alexander's purpose suddenly evaporated. The man he had pursued across continents was no longer alive, yet the echoes of that pursuit still pulsed inside him. He had expected triumph, a sense of finality, perhaps the satisfaction of closing a chapter that had begun the moment he crossed the Hellespont. Instead, standing beside the cold body of the last Achaemenid king, Alexander felt a hollow stillness settling over him. Persia had fallen, but the weight of its legacy, its vastness, its ancient dignity, seemed to rise around him like smoke from a pyre. He took the title King of Asia, yet the crown felt heavier than he imagined. Conquest was simple, but ruling the world he had broken open would demand more than battlefield brilliance. Alexander gathered his men and delivered a eulogy worthy of a defeated monarch, declaring that Darius had been betrayed by those he trusted most. By honoring the fallen king, Alexander signaled to the Persian nobles that their world would not be erased, only reshaped. This gesture, half respect, half strategic brilliance, began a subtle transformation in the way Persia viewed its conqueror. Some who had resisted now saw in Alexander the possibility of continuity, a ruler who might preserve what remained of their traditions even as he replaced their dynasty with his own ambition. But even as he played the role of a king inheriting an empire, a new threat emerged from the shadows of that collapsing world. Bessus, the satrap who had executed the last Achaemenid king, proclaimed himself the new ruler of Persia, taking the ancient name Artaxerxes in an attempt to legitimize his betrayal. To Alexander, this was an insult not just to Darius, but to the order he intended to create. A pretender could not be allowed to divide the empire. Bessus had to be captured, not simply for justice, but for symbolism. Persia's future could not be born from treachery. So the Macedonian army marched again, this time into the far reaches of Bactria and Sogdia, regions so distant and unforgiving that even the Persians considered them the edge of the world. The land grew harsher with every step. Mountains rose like jagged walls, rivers carved through deep ravines, and the air thinned as they climbed toward altitudes where breath became a ration. Villages clung to cliffs, their people living in a world shaped by ice and rock rather than by kings. Alexander had conquered empires, but now he was marching into nature itself, and nature offered no surrender. The pursuit of Bessus became a long and grueling chase. The traitor fled deeper into the wilderness, hoping the difficult terrain would slow the Macedonian advance. But Alexander refused to relent. He divided his forces into lighter, faster detachments, sending them through multiple paths in a sweeping hunt. His men crossed rivers that bit with cold, marched through forests dense and dark, and climbed slopes where one misstep meant death. Yet they pressed on, driven by a sense that the story of Persia could not end until the usurper was in chains.